Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Susan Foister. I'm the curator here, responsible for German painting and co-curator of the exhibition Strange Beauty. This is an exhibition, if you haven't yet seen it, which talks about German art in its own terms, in its own period, and in the history of the National Gallery's collection. And if you haven't seen it, there will be a chance, of course, for you to see it afterwards or at any time until the beginning of May.
And hello, my name is Jeanne Nuechterlein. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of York. And my specialism is in the Northern Renaissance period, particularly Germany and the Netherlands in the 15th and 16th centuries. So this exhibition proved to be an absolutely wonderful opportunity for me to get involved with the National Gallery and to see the process of how an exhibition is put together, which Susan has far more experience at than I do myself.
It seems quite a long time now since we first started talking about this exhibition and the opportunity that it represents. I've been, as you know, looking at our German collection here for a long time in collaboration with my colleagues in the scientific and conservation departments, particularly Rachel Billinge and Marika Spring. And we've been examining every painting in our collection in preparation for a new comprehensive catalogue of our German paintings, which will be published within the next couple of years. So with that in train, I thought that this might be a good moment to be looking at our German paintings specifically and a little bit at their history in the gallery. And with the University of York, we have an academic collaboration that goes back a few years now, so it seemed quite natural for me to think, yes, Jeanne, she might be interested in co-curating this exhibition.
Yeah, so we first met to talk about this, I think about 3 years ago?
Probably, yes.
It was around 3 years ago, and so we knew that we wanted to have an exhibition focused around the German painting collection here. And the question was really then what to do with the collection that hadn't been done before. So the idea was to think about a new kind of story that we could tell to the public. And part of the idea behind it, I have to say, was also inspired by research work that was done by another curator here at the National Gallery, Susanna Avery-Quash. So as it happened, when I came down from York to meet with Susan to talk about the exhibition for the first time, that was at the moment that there was a small exhibition showing some of the results of the research that Susanna was doing on the first director, Charles Eastlake. And within this exhibition, it included this absolutely wonderful quotation from Charles Eastlake in the 1860s when he went to Colmar and saw what is now considered one of the most important German Renaissance paintings, which is the Isenheim Altarpiece by Grunewald. And we have one drawing by Grunewald in our exhibition. And Eastlake described this painting as repulsive and disgusting. And I thought that was so fascinating. I mean, not just that he had that very negative reaction to a painting that we now consider to be really one of the great masterpieces, but also just the fact that he expressed it in such a direct way. And we started to think, actually, wouldn't it be interesting to think about the history of how people have responded to these German paintings, but then also really partly inspired by that overt commentary that Eastlake gave to actually invite people who visit the exhibition to feel like they are also welcomed to think about their own reaction and to express their own opinion.
Yeah, absolutely, and that was something that we hadn't done here before in an exhibition, so it's an experiment for us. I mean, we can show you the exhibition plan, so if you haven't been there before, room 6 up there is our comment room. So if you're going to see the exhibition after this, don't forget to visit that room and leave us your comments, because we've been having a lot of comments. Most people, I think, don't agree with Charles Eastlake, but
although if anyone does, you're more than welcome to say so. So the exhibition has, I would say that there are 3 different interlocking themes that run through it. So one of them is giving some of a taste of particularly the 19th century context of what the tastes were when this collection was founded, the kinds of artworks that people admired in the 19th and early 20th century. And that's really emphasized, particularly in the first room when you go through. And then after giving a bit more of a sense of the history of the collection, it then also particularly starts to examine what are the intrinsic qualities of German Renaissance art? What seem to be the features that are admired by those artists in its own time? And so then that then links into the idea of us thinking about what do we think about these artworks today. So it's those three things: the history of the collection, what is the nature of these artworks that have made them at times admired, at times not, and now we invite the audience to give their own response.
One of the things that fascinated me delving into the history of German painting in the gallery for this new catalogue was that the last catalogue, really the only comprehensive catalogue of German paintings, was published in 1959 by Michael Levy, who subsequently became director. And it was part of a series of catalogues published then in paperback form. It was quite a slim, yellow-backed catalogue. It's a really rare item now, if any of you happen to have it. And it was published as part of a series of catalogues, but at a moment when things were just about to change. So it seems almost unfortunate that he completed it in 1959, because that was an end of a really very passive moment, I think, in the gallery's collecting of German painting, that things had come in, but on the whole the gallery had not gone out and really sought to acquire them. And it was after that moment, which now appears really pivotal looking back, that the gallery consciously decided it really needed to go out and collect German painting, not just from the German Renaissance period, which our exhibition focuses on, but also from the 19th century as well. So now our collection looks very different, and it is indeed time for a new catalogue. But there was that moment in 1959, I think, of looking back and perhaps feeling, well, it's done, and yet it was all about to start again.
And I think Michael Levy was very important in changing the culture here and in seeing German art as being worthwhile and important. And when you go around the exhibition, I mean, this is also true of all the paintings that are in the collection, you can always look and see what date the paintings were acquired. And I would say really about half of the German collection was acquired from the 1960s onwards. So there's quite a lopsided history, this kind of trickle of works that come in over many, many decades. And then suddenly this decision is made that we need to build up the German collection from the 1960s onwards. Quite a lot more come in.
And that meant looking beyond the shores of the United Kingdom too. And I think one of the things that's very interesting looking at the exhibition is when you look at the paintings that were acquired in the 19th century or the early 20th century, you know that the people who consciously acquired them, on the whole, must have done so for some quite specific reason, quite consciously, and that they were certainly in the avant-garde of taste, I think, at that time.
Yes.
Sorry.
I was just about to say, probably what you were just about to say, was that I think this first slide that we're showing, this group of paintings, is a group of works that are shown in the first room of the exhibition. And it's meant to demonstrate what kind of painting was admired at the time that the National Gallery was founded. So we see this emphasis on landscapes, on large-scale figural paintings of the 16th and 17th century, which we see in the work on the upper right, which is one of the Carracci paintings here, and then particularly in the Raphael painting of St. Catherine in the lower center. And then we also have a school of Rembrandt work in the lower left. And then we also discuss in that first room how the kinds of early German paintings that were likely to be admired were ones that didn't look German. So
there's this accidental German painting lower right, which is a painting by an artist called Schweikart, which came into the gallery in 1852. It was left to the gallery. And it's an example of a sort of accidental German acquisition, really, because obviously it looks completely Dutch, and you can even see that the recumbent cows are exactly in the landscape, exactly in the tradition of Dutch painting. And in the exhibition we've put it next to a painting by Potter, and clearly it depends on Potter for this composition.
Absolutely. So this is the kind of painting that people expected to see in the 19th century, at least the kind of circles that were involved in the foundation of the gallery and in the government and the trustees and so on. And then another feature that we show in that first room in our next slide So there's a very deliberate juxtaposition that we've included that faces you as you walk into that room. And you'll see in front of you this juxtaposition of 3 paintings, and in the center is a quintessential German Renaissance painting by Hans Baldo Green. And we have that juxtaposed to the Raphael on the one side, exemplifying really the artist that was considered the greatest, most important artist of the Western tradition, so much admired. And then on the other side, we have the Van Eyck-Arnolfini work, which is a type of painting that had not previously, for the last couple of centuries, been very heavily admired, but it was starting to be admired, that kind of painting, and particularly the very delicate, fine technique of his use of oil paint, and that sense of almost looking into a complete interior room of the 15th century. And the Baldung is meant to be the painting that stands out from everything else in that room.
Which it really does, yeah.
So you just see in many respects, it's very unnaturalistic. So the contrast between the very large, half-sized figures there with these very small donor figures that are at the bottom, this very stark emotion that you have, a kind of very flat background in the figures kind of projecting forwards, but not with that kind of delicacy, refinement of technique that you see in the Van Eyck. The application of paint is very different.
Now, I remember you coming up with the idea of that juxtaposition. Was the Baldung your absolute sort of first thought of what German painting people should be confronted with when they came into the exhibition?
I think so, and the reason is because one of the features that we then go on to talk about in a subsequent room of the exhibition, the things that characterize German Renaissance painting, one of the most important of them is expression, and this very strong emotional impact, which isn't about having a beautiful figure with a kind of beautiful, delicate expression. It's very much about a very tragic emotion. And I think also the sense of Baldung isn't trying to make his figures live up to a certain ideal, I think. He's got his own sense of how you make a human figure powerful. And I think that that's really exemplified in this particular painting, as you have the body of Christ being shown and presented to the viewer. And it's almost asking you, the viewer, to respond to the body of Christ in the same way that the Virgin Mary on one side and John on the other side do. That it's inviting that kind of very powerful emotional response, which is very different from, I think, the way that you're expected to respond to the St. Catherine. I mean, she herself is a saint who was tortured, but that's not what you're seeing in this particular painting. You're seeing her in a very beautiful contrapposto, gazing up into heaven. Very different reaction, I think.
This painting also has an interesting history, doesn't it? Because we know it was in England in the 18th century, rather strangely. We don't know how it got here, but we know that the little figures there were actually thought to be English people. They were thought to be members of the Howard family, the families of the Dukes of Norfolk. So this was the interest of this painting for people in the 18th and 19th centuries, that it represented English history and it wasn't connected to Germany in any way at all.
So that maybe that's part of what made it palatable at that particular time.
Yeah. It might be just worth saying a word about the way the exhibition's been designed and presented, because when you walk into the first room, it's set out in such a way that you feel that you are in the Angustine collection, because there are screens that are taken from an early watercolour of the founding collection of the National Gallery. And we were working with new designers on this exhibition, and I think we found it quite a stimulating experience, didn't we? So that was completely their idea.
Yeah, so we had a lot of interesting back and forth about how to create the kind of ambiance that we wanted. So we had a sense that we wanted the exhibition to feel bold and fresh and contemporary, while also giving a bit of a sense of the historical context. And I think the use of colors in the different rooms is one feature of how that's been played through, and also that idea of walking through the screens. And can I also just mention, it's one of those things that I bet most people don't actually see when they go into that front room, but the screens that you walk through, it's got a projection of a watercolor image on it. which was made in the 1830s, and it represents the Angerstein collection before it moved to this building. And one of the paintings that you can see is the Kuyp landscape, which is also actually on the wall. So when you walk in and kind of look to the upper left, you can actually see the representation of it and then actually see the painting on the wall, which is something that we didn't plan, but then it went up and we're like, oh, how exciting.
Serendipity, but I remember you pointing that out. Yes.
Yeah, so you can actually see that connection between the historical collection and what's actually in the room around you.
So then, moving into the history of the 19th century and this boldly coloured room, which then contrasts really with the rooms in which we move right back to the German Renaissance itself. And this is a room where we talk about different collectors, but also about different altarpieces. And we're lucky here to be able to put together the Aachen altarpiece, which is divided historically between the National Gallery and the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool, who own the two shutters that you can see in this slide. And we just have, the central, well, I can get it, the central panel, which is there. Paintings which came into this country in the period in which churches in Europe were being secularized, and this was a great opportunity for those collectors who were interested in this kind of Gothic, primitive painting as they saw it. And when I see this, I always think of people like Pugin going over in a rowing boat to the Low Countries in order to snap up paintings and sculpture of this time and bring them back to the very small number of people in this country who would have been interested in them at this time.
And I think also this painting exemplifies again, some of the features of German art that to some audiences were very appealing and interesting. So this attention to detail, there's so much emphasis on each individual figure and the clothing and the textures of the textiles, but then also the gestures and the complex motion that's taking place within this work. Now this work, it was given as a gift to the National Gallery in 1847, I think it was. So it's actually, it's the first German painting of that period that came to the collection. And the trustees accepted it, and then they immediately put it in the boardroom and didn't show it to anybody. So it's almost as if they thought, okay, we'll take it for our collection, but do we really want people to see it? Not sure. And it actually wasn't until the 1880s that they decided to take it out of storage and actually put it on public display.
I mean, one of the things that I think must have made it quite offensive to people who so much admired the more classical style of painting represented by Raphael is the way in which there's so much action, and it's an action which takes place at different times, even in the same field of painting. So it's unlike classical drama. Things are going on from different periods, from before the crucifixion and then Christ being taken down from the cross afterwards. So it is in that way a very unclassical type of painting.
Absolutely. And I think we also then see in a number of the other works that tend to get acquired in the 19th century, there are a lot of portraits that get bought later on. And one of the things that we're hoping to emphasize in that second room is how a lot of the German paintings that came in, particularly in the 19th and early 20th century, came from collectors, really more than the National Gallery making a point of going out and acquiring works itself. But when it did acquire works, it tended to be portraits, the ones that it actually went out and wanted, rather than this kind of religious, emotional, dramatic painting.
Yeah, and I think not just religious, but very Roman Catholic in its subject and treatment, which I think in Protestant England in the 19th century, where Catholics had only recently been emancipated, it was difficult. So I think this applies actually to paintings in the Italian Renaissance part of the collection as well as the German paintings. There was always this difficulty with these very Catholic subjects. When in doubt, turn to portraits. So proportionately, there are always far more of those than there are of crucifixions.
Absolutely. And when they did acquire religious works, they tended to have a slightly different character, as I think we can see in some of the other works here. So here we have the Kruger episode.
Yes.
Yes, and I should say that we are working with a PhD student on this project who had funding to work together with us in relation to the exhibition. And she chose to work particularly on this very interesting episode of this collection of works that was brought together in Germany in Westphalia. And then this collection of early German paintings. And then this collection was bought by the government, essentially. William Gladstone, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, worked together with the painter William Dyce to acquire this collection. And in a sense, really just told the National Gallery after the fact, I have negotiated, I have bought this collection, it's coming. And you kind of see from the minutes, and I think also there's a display of archive material which is in the collection that you can then see in the case there, kind of telling you a little bit about that history of how William Dyce and Gladstone obviously expect this to be a worthy and interesting collection. There are particular issues they're interested in with the sense of the early spirituality that you can see in early paintings. And then these are brought to the trustees, and then a few months later, when the paintings actually arrive, it's very clear when you read the minutes that they're kind of like, these paintings have arrived. We don't know what to do with them. We're going to put them in storage till you tell us what to do with them.
And there were a lot of them as well,
yes.
57.
Yes, and there's quite a lot of paintings. And they partly kind of say, oh, we don't have enough space to hang them. But you can see in other cases, when there's paintings that they want, they'll find space, they'll find space for them. But in this particular case, they're like, oh, we don't have space to hang these. What should we do with them?
Yeah, I mean, this was a collection that had been built up by Kruger, who was a German official who had a passion for trying to recreate the story of Westphalian painting, and had taken every opportunity to recover paintings from churches that had been secularized and disestablished in early 19th century Westphalia. And there was a small group of people who felt this passion. And he had tried, hadn't he, to sell that collection to Berlin, but for whatever reason, they weren't interested in it. And I think the kind of dialogue between Berlin and the National Gallery in terms of what they were trying to acquire in this period, and not just of German art, is always very interesting indeed. But Berlin didn't take this collection, so the National Gallery did. And I suppose to go from a situation in which the National Gallery at that stage had a handful of German works, literally 4 or 5 of them, to a situation in which they potentially had 57, was completely overwhelming. And, yes, they were aghast, I think.
Yes, and I think, and it's interesting to try to think back to what extent were they aghast because they thought the paintings were terrible, or was it partly also the fact that a lot of them were fragments from larger works? And so one of the features that we wanted to emphasize in that second room was the fact that at the center of this collection was this whole group of panels that came from what used to be a single altarpiece with different panels, but they came together to create a single work. It's not entirely clear. At some point in its history, probably in the 18th century, the altarpiece had been damaged and it had then been broken up. And in the period of secularization, these had then entered into the private collection. And I think that in the 19th century, it was very difficult for people to appreciate the original purpose of an artwork like this, that it was on an altarpiece and it had a liturgical function. People thought in the 19th century about paintings as independent works, and they just looked at each individual panel as if it were a separate artwork in itself. And I think that contributed to the fact that when they then decided, okay, we'll keep a few works from this collection, but we're going to then sell off the ones that we don't like, they didn't try to keep all of the works of this painting together. They selected the panels that they liked the most, I suppose, and were happy to just chuck the rest of them out, which is why then when we're trying to do this reconstruction here, you see this mix of the panels that are still here in the collection, other ones that we have been able to trace the history of them and we know where the bits of fragments have ended up, but there's plenty of missing parts as well, so lots of bits that we don't actually know what's happened to them.
Yeah, I mean, bits of the Kruger collection do still turn up. I mean, it's been distributed all over the world. There are bits in the Metropolitan Museum, there are bits in Germany, there are bits in collections in this country, but occasionally things do turn up. For me, to be able to do some justice to this altarpiece in this exhibition is a wonderful opportunity, because generally, the pieces that we have and display upstairs in the Sainsbury wing are displayed on 2 adjacent walls, really going round a corner. So I think it's very hard for anyone to have a sense of the scale of it, what this enormous crucifixion scene with its full-length saints must have looked like, how these shutters, what you're seeing here, the passion scenes, the outside faces of the shutters and the inner faces are lost. To have some sense of what it looks like, and an exhibition, it seems to me, is a marvellous opportunity to do that. Now, you came in when we were starting to hang, and we were doing what we called the paper hang, putting large pieces of brown paper on the walls to get the positions for everything. And then you came back towards the end, and you saw this
and there it was, yes.
Yeah, so what did you think when you saw it like this for the first time?
It's really remarkable. One of the things that fascinates me about this work is the contrast between, I don't know how easy it is to get a sense of that, but in the central section there was this crucifixion scene with these figures of saints, and you originally had a gold background, a very flat gold background, so it would have kind of gleamed and had a very vivid effect. And then you have these representational scenes on the smaller subjects at the side. And just getting a sense of that use of gold with colors and the conjunction of all the different parts together is quite striking. Another thing I have to say that does really strike me about this reconstruction, in relation to what we were talking about earlier about the dangerous or difficult subjects for, in the Catholic emancipation and so on, is the fact that Christ's body is mostly gone. So you'll notice that his head is there, and then there are kind of bits, I suppose, just one leg a little bit, you see a bit, because they were obviously interested in the 3 saints rather than the body of Christ. It's almost as if they're like, oh, let's kind of get rid of this, difficult subject and kind of keep little kind of pieces around it. You also have bits of angels, again, are not pieces that the National Gallery kept in this collection.
No, but I guess they would have made them quite saleable, all these sort of perfect-looking heads, really,
yes.
without the bodies.
Yes, and kind of divide them up, yeah. But I think we do have a sense that there's still probably more research to be done about this work and the ways in which the different parts of it fit together.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And there have been a lot of different attempts to reconstruct it. In fact, almost as soon as the 1959 catalogue was published, the reconstructions proposed at that time were disproved. There were exhibitions in Westphalia that tried to reconstruct it, but we now know an awful lot more about how it might have looked. And really doing this in the exhibition is an opportunity to see, well, visually, does it work? I mean, I think we might go back to it at the end of the exhibition and play with it a little bit more, because this is such an opportunity to get it right. And of course, it's a bit difficult when you've got everything in it in frames as well. Yeah. It's an opportunity to get it as right as we can, and to see whether what people have put forward as a reconstruction seems to work on the wall visually. I think it's also important because in the National Gallery, most of our paintings, particularly our northern paintings, our German paintings, are very small usually. There are portraits and there are small paintings. And it's very easy for people, say, to visit the Sainsbury Wing and come away thinking that, there weren't any northern altarpieces, or they never painted large paintings, which isn't the impression you'd get from visiting some European collections.
Where you'd get a very, very different perspective, I think.
So this redresses that imbalance, I think.
I just mentioned one of the things that just slightly troubles me about this reconstruction. We talked about this, in fact, I think just before it opened. I don't know how easily you can see that. So next to this central scene, there is an Annunciation at the upper left, and then there is a presentation in the temple down below that. I have to say that perspective of the Annunciation really bothers me, because I feel like if the recession is going off that way, then it ought to be on the other side rather than on that side. And yet in terms of the subject matter, when you try to think, well, what subjects work, you think, well, it must be there, and yet it looks very odd. So I think these are the kinds of things that we'll continue to think about. Or did they just not think about perspective in the same way that we do, so they didn't mind? Who knows?
No, it's a good point. Should we talk about Prince Albert?
Yes.
Oh, there's some more parts from the Kruger collection.
Yeah, so another set of paintings that came in at a relatively early stage to the National Gallery in the 19th century was a set of works that had been acquired by Prince Albert, the German consort of Queen Victoria, not actually quite intentionally. There's a group of paintings that were owned by his cousin, I think it was, the Oettingen Wallerstein.
Yes.
And he was deeply in debt, so he tried to sell this collection and couldn't. And then essentially he gave it to Albert. Albert kind of stood as sort of surety, basically.
Yes, he underwrote the debt, but he defaulted, so he was left with the paintings.
Yeah, so Prince Albert was then left with this group of paintings, which actually included a range. It also included Netherlandish works and Italian works as well. And what then happened was that after Prince Albert died, Queen Victoria offered the entire collection of some 75 or so paintings, I think, were in the entire collection. She offered it to the National Gallery. And Charles Eastlake, the director, went through and chose which ones he wanted to keep for the National Gallery and gave the rest back. And what we're showing on this slide are 3 of the works that Eastlake chose for the National Gallery. So the 2 with the gold backgrounds, and then the lovely portrait of the woman with a fly on her headdress, which is, I think, one of the kind of highlights, I think, that people particularly admire of these works. And then we're also showing this, what I think is a really wonderful portrait by Baldo in the upper right, which Eastlake decided, no, we don't want that one. Well, you can have that. So now that painting, it's still in the Royal Collection. It's not one of the ones, we could have had it. But no, Eastlake didn't want it. So.
But I think it wasn't even thought of as German at that time, was it? I think
well,
it was...
they weren't really sure who painted it.
No.
I mean, if he'd known that it was Baldo, he definitely wouldn't have taken it, because Eastlake did not like Baldo. He thought Baldo was a terrible painter. Which, of course, we don't have to agree with him on that. But I think it's very striking to see the kinds of works that Eastlake chose and that he thought would be appropriate for the National Gallery. And I think he did have a sense that the National Gallery should have some exemplars of early German painting, so that people could see what were the characteristics of that school, as it was called. So people were very interested in the different schools of art, the German, the French, the Italian, etc., and giving specimens of them so that people could analyze what characterized them.
We can see that just if we go forward. Because the Cranach woman on the right particularly was acquired, was it in 1863 as a specimen by Eastlake?
Yes, and that's one of the ones that he bought. So these are actually both paintings that Eastlake specifically approved. And in the case of the Baldo painting, which used to be attributed to Dürer on the left, he recommended that the trustees buy it. This is before he became director, and they agreed to that, so they bought that. And then a few years later, when he was director, he bought the Cranach. And you kind of get this sense that for him, these portraits were really wonderful exemplars of German painting. So you could immediately see the characteristics of them that are very different from Italian art. But the 2 paintings are also very different from each other in character. So I think that he thought, oh, these are good specimens by which people can have a sense of what German painting is, but without that horrible expressionism that he personally found very difficult.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting that the Baldo was bought from a continental collection, from a French collection. And he was prepared to look beyond the shores of this country in order to find exactly the right works for this collection. But the Baldo was bought in a group of works from that collection, so it wasn't simply bought for itself, which I think is an important point. It's interesting, too, that these are 16th century works, which I suppose in some ways are a counterbalance to both the Prince Albert, Oettingen Wallerstein works and the Kruger Collection works. So with those together, perhaps there was felt a need to fill out the 16th century a little bit more at that time.
And I think also the kind of religious work that Eastlake was most likely to approve was a more softer, refined, delicate kind of religious picture. And I think the ones that he chose from the Prince Albert collection exemplify those characteristics and are very different from actually what we've got on our next slide, which is our Altdorfer, which in many ways really exemplifies strange beauty.
Yes, it is in many ways a very strange painting. And one of the things that was interesting to me, we ought to mention the article that you wrote for the Burlington magazine in February, which any of you should refer to if you want the complete history of the gallery's acquisition of German painting in the 19th century. One of the things, though, that you brought out there was even in the 20th century, quite late in the 20th century, people found this painting very strange. So it was acquired by the National Gallery in the 70s, was it?
No, it was 1980 when they actually bought it. 1980,
yeah.
Yeah, and it's very interesting that they spent a couple of years, I think, doing some conservation and cleaning work, and then in 1983 had a focused exhibition displaying the painting and showing some other related works around it. And it's fascinating to go through the archives at the National Gallery. You could see press clippings where people wrote reviews of the show. And this particularly fascinating one that I found of someone who wrote about this painting was very, very eloquent, actually, in the way that she described the work and the impact that it has, but clearly saw this as a very bizarre work. Powerful, yet very strange. And yet, I think by that time in the 1980s, the very strangeness of it, the emotional power of it, was seen as part of its strength and was seen as part of what we should admire in the work. Whereas I think when you go back to previous decades, what they saw was the strangeness, but not necessarily what was admirable or important or valuable about that.
And this was also a period in which the gallery started to acquire 19th century German works as well. So I think about this alongside the gallery's acquisition of the Little Friedrich landscape, for example, in the same period, where I think that sort of romanticism reflected in the landscape there is, in a way, to be found in this painting as well, if you think of the way in which Altdorfers use the sunset that you see through the arch. Absolutely. I think in a way that you could almost associate with Friedrich, with the Gothic architecture, and then the blaze leading you to think about Christ's fate, his death when he goes to Jerusalem, the journey that his mother has pleaded with him not to go on, and now she's falling in a faint at the thought of him undertaking that. I think it speaks to the same sort of sensibilities somehow.
Absolutely, yes. And this is a room that we decided, we have two rooms in the exhibition that are particularly focused around what are the key themes that we see at the heart of these works. And we chose to put this one in the invention and expression room. So with that emphasis on the sense of the personal style that artists are developing in their work and their interest in unusual subjects or familiar subjects from a different perspective. We could have easily, I think, just as easily put it in our beauty and nature room, because I think it's a painting that exemplifies all of those qualities.
Yeah, and in that room we have the first Altdorfer that the gallery bought in 1963, which is a pure landscape painting. But I remember one of the things we talked about in relation to this room was people tackling the same subject but from completely different ways, and this is what the woodcut by Cranach and the beautiful drawing by Altdorfer here really seem to exemplify. The same very traditional subject but treated in quite revolutionary ways.
Yes, and also by choosing these two works, we can also see two different exemplars of the different graphic media that these artists exemplified. It's really fascinating actually that when you look back through the history of attitudes towards German Renaissance art, that although, as we've been discussing, there was a lot of difficulty people had with paintings, they actually tended to admire the graphic works much more. And I think maybe that partly has to do with the fact that there's something about a work on paper that exemplifies emphasis on line, that people found that they could appreciate and admire, and especially the innovations that they could see that German artists brought to works on paper, that they actually found much more difficult when it was translated into a painted medium. But in this particular case, we see Cranach's work is actually a woodcut, although on the surface of it, it doesn't look like a woodcut. He's combined, you have one block which has the black lines that you can see, which is printed onto the page. And then you have a highlight block with this kind of orangey brown color that you see. And that's actually a separate wood block, and they're both kind of printed onto a page and line it up with each other, with certain parts of the blank paper left to shine through as highlights. So it's actually a printed medium, but trying to create certain sorts of painterly effects. And then you see here this very odd position, actually, that St. Christopher is in, where he's just carried the Christ child across the river, and he's got one leg that he's kind of sticking out onto the shore and about to kind of hoist himself back up onto the shore on that side. And you get a sense of the context that they're in, a bit of, again, that emphasis on landscape and the foliage and so on. And then next to it, you have this graphic work by Altdorfer, which is truly one of the strangest depictions of St. Christopher. So I don't know if you can quite see that we're actually seeing Christopher more or less from the back, and the Christ child seems to be kind of leaning on his head. I'm not really entirely sure even kind of what the emphasis of that gesture is. You can
see a little bit of beard, can't you, of St. Christopher peeping over his shoulder.
Yeah, so he's kind of looking back almost as if he's kind of like, what are you pounding on my head like that for?
He gets heavier and heavier in the legend, doesn't he?
Yeah, it's almost as if it's kind of giving you that sense of like the pushing down of the weight is being emphasized. And then you see how like there's very little sense of the context. Most of that is stripped away. And what he's really emphasizing in, so he's used this liquid white highlight together with pen in order to create these very dramatic contrasts between the very dark lines and the white bright highlights, which are then set against a colored paper so that you get this chiaroscuro effect created by that medium. And I especially love the way that he's done the flowering rod and the emphasis again on that sweep of the lines, which it almost has as much to do with what creates a striking graphic effect rather than simply trying to represent a scene in a naturalistic way.
Yeah, to me, I mean, that is the most beautiful, economical and expressive drawing, and it's very characteristic of Altdorfer in that so much of the paper is left to the effects of those twigs and branches right at the top, very much like the amount of space that he gives to the trees in the Christ taking leave, or the Altdorfer landscape, indeed, and the way that, I mean, just the way his arm sort of flows into the branch, and the way that the cloak is flung over his shoulder, almost as though the whole thing is a branch of a tree. It's really extraordinary. And I always particularly enjoy putting on exhibitions here where we can bring in drawings and prints and put them in relation to paintings. That's always particularly enjoyable to do. So we really have some great drawings in this exhibition.
Yes,
absolutely. We had fun going to the British Museum and selecting them, didn't we?
Yes, we at one point we went and we were kind of flipping through cartons of things and deciding what to choose.
Yeah, the best examples of really different types of invention and expression in these drawings.
And also different media. So some of them are using charcoal. So for instance, The Severed Head, another brilliant piece, I think, by Hans Borkmeier, where he's really using that roughness of his materials to convey that sort of horrific impression of his head that has literally just been cut off and is confronting you. Contrasted with this much more delicate use of, for instance, the pen and ink that you see with Dürer's studies of a child's head that he did in relation to the Melancholia, or indeed the other works here.
One of the things that I liked that you suggested particularly was in the room which looks at nature and beauty, in which the drawing of the two heads, the two male heads by Baldo is included, that you were very keen to include examples of male beauty.
Yes, because we didn't want people to think that, if it's about beauty, then it must be about women.
Yeah.
We really wanted it to be about artistic beauty of all kinds. And I have to say that for me, that was one of the most exciting things to actually see in person. In fact, I think that's one that we chose on the basis of seeing it in reproduction. I have to confess, I hadn't actually seen it in person before it arrived here. And I was just so thrilled when I actually saw it in person, because I think there's something about these graphic works. Well, it's true of paintings as well, but also graphic works, that to actually get right up to them and see the way they're using the lines and the materials, it's so different from seeing them in reproduction. And that work is so powerful and so effective. And I think it's one of the most beautiful works in the exhibition, even though it's portraying male figures that don't exemplify, human beauty in a traditional sense.
I think it's that sort of sense of going against traditional notions of beauty and of linearity together that's probably made German painting or German art quite difficult for people to digest. I was thinking about that comment by the painter Ford Madox Brown in the 1850s when he came to see that Baldung portrait and said it was mapped rather than painted. And at that time it was thought to be a work by Dürer rather than Baldo. But it was too linear even for somebody who associated all the time with the pre-Raphaelite painters, which seems to me quite curious, really.
Absolutely. And I think that people, as I mentioned earlier, I think people could appreciate it a little bit more when they were actually looking at a graphic work. But if they saw something equivalent in a painted work, they just thought, well, actually, that's not what we think painting ought to be.
Yeah. Now, one of the artists who plays a big role in the largest room of the exhibition is Holbein, who often tends to be thought of as an honorary British artist rather than a German artist. So we've tried to bring out some of the German aspects here, as well as just the familiar British ones. But there's a very interesting story behind the print of the Maya Madonna, isn't there?
Yes, so most of the works by Holbein that are best known in this country are his portraits, which he did particularly in his later career after he moved to England. But while he was still working on the continent, so he was a German painter, spent a lot of his career in Basel, one of the Swiss cities. He painted this really remarkable portrait of the mayor with his family together with the Virgin and Child. And this painting, as it was known for actually a couple of centuries, there was a version of it that was in Dresden, which everyone thought was the original version of this painting. And during the 19th century, another version of it surfaced, then in Darmstadt. So we had the Dresden version and the Darmstadt version. And there ensued a lot of debate between painters, connoisseurs, art historians about which was the original one. And it's very intriguing that Charles Eastlake, that first director who didn't particularly care for German painting, he thought the Dresden version was the superior. He thought this one is much better. Nowadays we recognize it was actually the Darmstadt was the original one. And what Eastlake admired about the Dresden version, it was actually a 17th century copy that was a slight improvement upon the original. And those who had a kind of 17th century taste thought that was better and admired it more. And what we're seeing in the print that we've shown here is a version of the painting. We think that this was probably done after the Dresden version. So it's actually not quite the original Holbein work. And one of the things we wanted to emphasize here, well, a couple of different things. One was the importance of religious subjects for some of Holbein's early works, which are difficult to appreciate here. But also that sense that for many people in the 19th century, especially before the invention of photography, they would have actually only known a lot of paintings through reproductive prints,
exactly, yes,
rather than being able to see, the original works.
Well, that's right. So I think one of the questions that's raised is, how do you recognize a Holbein? How do you recognize a Dürer? And I mean, this is always a story that's interesting to retell, but the painting that you're seeing top right there, as it looks now, a painting by a 15th century South German artist known as the master of the Murnau portrait, was in the 18th century sold as a portrait of Martin Luther by Holbein, and it looked, as you see it, lower right. And that was how it came to the National Gallery in the early 1990s, and then that false background was very carefully removed, and we now see it as it was. But obviously Holbein was a really saleable artist. So in that way, perhaps he wasn't typically German.
Yes, and there's almost a sense of, because he lived in this country, but also I think because of something about the nature of his style, that he was particularly easy for audiences in this country to appreciate and to admire. And one of the kind of questions that we leave a bit up for debate in that room is the extent to which we see each of those three major artists, Holbein, Dürer, and Kronach, are they kind of equally German? Do we see Holbein as being, in a certain sense, slightly less quintessentially German because of the nature of his style and that almost photographic quality that you see in some of his portraits, which is actually quite different, really, from Dürer and Kronach, I think.
Yeah, very much so. And also the paintings from the National Gallery's collection remind us that, again, we see him as a portraitist and not as the author of religious works, as in the Maya print or the Dance of Death woodcuts, which also feature in one of our rooms. Perhaps we ought to end with just talking about Dürer and his reputation.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so we've got a number of really wonderful Holbein works in this collection, and we've just got a couple of Dürer works in this collection. I just wanted to show in this slide. In the center is one of the most famous paintings by Albrecht Dürer. It's currently in Munich. It's been there for centuries and centuries, actually. And we represented that work in the exhibition through this reproductive print, although, as you can maybe see by the juxtaposition, it's a little bit of an interpretation. So it's not just showing the painting exactly as it exists, but it's almost like the artist's reinterpretation, in a sense, of Dürer's self-portrait. And then we've also got this portrait of Dürer's father, which was acquired early in the 20th century as well.
Yeah, I mean, this was a painting that seems to have been in Charles I's collection and was presented to him by the city of Nuremberg, so it has a very long association with this country. And yet it doesn't seem quite right as a Dürer. There's been a lot of technical examination done on it, a lot of investigation into its history. And none of that really seems to authenticate it as a Dürer. It seems likely to have been one of the many copies of Dürer's works made around 1600 in the period people call the Dürer Renaissance. So it was one that really sort of got away from the gallery, as it were.
But when it was acquired, there was quite a lot of debate in the press about, at that time, whether it was authentic or not. And the director at that time was adamant that it absolutely was by Dürer.
That's right. And then there was a similar debate when the large painting of the Virgin in a Garden was acquired at the end of the Second World War, which was a sort of interesting time to be acquiring a German painting. And then finally, most recently, we've acquired the Little Saint Jerome, which was thought to be an Italian painting, first of all. So these things can change and shift enormously. So is there any one thing that you sort of come away with at the end of the exhibition, now that it's all there and everything is installed?
Well, one of the things, I'm actually really excited by the colors and the lighting in the exhibition. We thought quite a lot about how the different rooms would be lit, and there's a little bit of a difference between the way that the invention room and the beauty and nature room are lit and designed compared to the others. And I think, actually, to me, I think it's a very vivid visual effect when you go through the works. And I actually love the paintings as much as I ever did.
Yeah, so they look beautiful rather than strange.
Or maybe both, but
both.
Interestingly strange, perhaps.
Yeah, good. Well, thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the exhibition.